I built Crown Atrium with my own hands before I ever put a wedding ring on.
I built Crown Atrium with my own hands before I ever put a wedding ring on. That's the part nobody at that gala ever understood. They saw a black woman in a burgundy suit holding a leather folder, and they assumed I was somebody's assistant, somebody's plus one, somebody's wife, standing quietly in the background of somebody else's empire. What they didn't know was that the marble under their $2,000 shoes belonged to me. Every lease, every access badge, every dollar that moved through that building's accounts answered to one signature. Mine. For 3 years, the world called me Mrs. Han. But before I was anybody's wife, I was the sole owner of Calloway Retail Holdings, and Crown Atrium was the crown jewel of a portfolio my grandmother started with a single strip mall and a stubborn refusal to sell. I never advertised what I owned. I let people underestimate me. It made the fall so much sweeter when it finally came. Jun-Ho walked into my life the way lightning walks into a house that's already wired wrong. Charming, composed, dangerous in a way you feel in your spine before your brain catches up. 3 years ago, he was a mid-level operations manager running freight contracts nobody important cared about. 3 years later, he was president of Han Vantage Group, a logistics and import conglomerate with its headquarters occupying 4 full floors of my building. People whispered that he'd built it from nothing. What they never said out loud, because they were too afraid, was that Han Vantage Group was the polished, tax-compliant face of something much older and much darker the Bake family's reach into legitimate commerce, laundered clean through freight manifests and warehouse leases. And every single one of those leases ran through Crown Atrium. Through me. I financed his rise without ever putting my name on a single document tied to his company. I signed the marriage certificate as Vivienne Calloway Han. I signed every business filing as Vivienne Calloway, CEO of Calloway Retail Holdings, LLC. 2 names, 2 ledgers, 1 woman who never let the personal touch the professional. That distinction was about to save my life. People ask me sometimes why a woman who owned an entire commercial empire ever fell for a man who arrived with nothing but a rented suit and a freight schedule. The honest answer is that Jun never once tried to charm my money. He charmed my loneliness instead, which is a far more dangerous thing to be good at. My grandmother built Calloway Retail Holdings from a single strip mall in a neighborhood nobody else wanted to invest in, and by the time she passed the keys to me, I had inherited both an empire and an instinct to trust no one who asked too many questions about it. Jun never asked. That was the first warning sign I mistook for respect. We married quietly. No press, no announcement beyond a small notice in a trade paper that nobody in his circle bothered reading. I liked it that way. I liked that Jun Vantage, as it was called then, before he renamed it Han Vantage Group once the company started turning real profit grew inside the walls of my own building without a single financier realizing whose wife was signing off on the lease renewals every year. I told myself it was humility. Looking back, it was armor, and it was the only reason I was still standing 3 years later when the whole thing came apart in a single night. The morning it all cracked open, I was standing in the atrium's unfinished east wing, walking the marble installers through the unveiling we had scheduled for the following evening, a grand relaunch of Crown Atrium's top floor as a private members' concourse. The kind of event that would put international financiers in the same room as half the shipping executives on the eastern seaboard. My phone buzzed. A calendar alert, then a text that wasn't meant for me. "Baby, did you see the transfer?" Nadia sent it from Jun's assistant account by mistake, meant for a different thread entirely. 300,000 for the apartment. Tell your wife it's for warehouse insurance. She'll never check. I read it twice. Then a third time, slower. The way you read something you already know is true, but need your body to catch up with your mind. I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that. Because women like me are always expected to fall apart in these moments, and I have never once given anyone that satisfaction. I felt my spine straighten instead. $300,000 of Han Vantage Group's insurance budget routed to an apartment for his mistress, and he'd used my building's own accounting software to disguise it. He'd built his empire's foundation on my marble, and now he was using my own systems to fund his affair. I didn't call him. I didn't scream. I called Desmond instead. Desmond Okafor had run security for Calloway Retail Holdings since before I could legally sign my own contracts. He'd worked for my grandmother, standing quietly at the edge of every negotiation she ever closed, watching men in better suits than his underestimate a woman who could buy and sell their companies twice over before lunch. When she passed the business to me, she only gave me one piece of advice about the transition, and it was about him. "Keep Desmond close," she said, "and keep him closer than anyone you marry, because a man who guards your building without ever asking to own a piece of it is worth more than every investor who's ever smiled at you across a boardroom table." I never forgot that. Desmond had watched Jun move into my life with the same quiet, unreadable expression he wore, watching every contractor, every tenant, every so-called ally who ever walked through Crown Atrium's doors. And in 3 years, he never once said a critical word about my marriage out loud. He didn't need to. He simply kept the ledgers clean, kept the cameras running, and waited, the same way I did, for the day the truth would finally need somewhere safe to land. He knew where every camera in that building pointed, and, more importantly, he knew how to keep a secret until the exact second I needed it spoken out loud. Pull every transaction Han Vantage Group has routed through our building's finance portal in the last 6 months, I told him. Quietly. I want it on my desk by tonight. "Understood, Miss Calloway," he said. "Not Mrs. Hahn. He never called me that. He always knew which name mattered." That evening, I went to the boutique on the 2nd floor of the Atrium LaRousse Fine Jewelry, one of my own tenants, to approve the final display case for tomorrow's unveiling. I wasn't there as the owner. I was there in a plain grey coat, no entourage, the way I preferred to move through my own building when I wanted to see how my staff actually treated people who didn't announce themselves. That's when Nadia Prescott walked in like she owned the floor. I recognized her instantly from Jun's company directory, though I'd only ever seen her photo in an org chart. Tall, polished, dressed in a wine-red gown clearly meant for tomorrow's event, flanked by 2 Han Vantage security men like she was already somebody's queen. "Tomorrow is Han Vantage Group's celebration," she announced to the boutique manager, loud enough for the whole floor to hear. "President Han wants the sapphire cuff in the window. Wrap it. Put it under his account." The manager, new, nervous, didn't recognize me in my plain coat. "Ma'am, I'll need someone to authorize the account transfer. Do you know who I am?" Nadia snapped. "I'm Jun-Ho Han's partner, his real partner, not the woman who signs his checks and disappears. Wrap it, or I'll have your manager's manager fired by morning. If you're watching this from Atlanta, Houston, or Chicago, drop your city below, because what happened next has happened in a boardroom or a dealership or a jewelry counter in every one of those cities, and every woman who's ever been talked over by somebody wearing borrowed confidence knows exactly what I felt standing there. I said nothing yet. I let her keep talking. That's a skill nobody teaches you in business school, the discipline to let your enemy build the entire case against themselves before you say a single word. And while you're at it, Nadia added, gesturing toward the center display case, a hand-blown glass installation I had personally commissioned for $85,000 to showcase tomorrow's unveiling collection. Move that hideous thing. It's blocking the light for photos. That installation isn't part of tonight's inventory, the clerk said carefully. It's a fixture for tomorrow's event. I'm not authorized to move it. Then I'll move it myself, Nadia said, and before anyone could stop her, she shoved the base of the case hard enough that it toppled off its pedestal, glass shattering across the marble floor in a bright, expensive spray. A few onlookers gasped. The clerk went white. $85,000, I said quietly, stepping closer to survey the wreckage without a flicker of alarm on my face. That's what that case cost, before installation. It's a case, Nadia said, unbothered, nudging a shard aside with the toe of her heel. Han Vantage Group can cover it. President Han has money to spare, unlike whoever ordered something that fragile for a public floor. I'll make sure it's covered, I said. One way or another. Good, Nadia said, satisfied, already turning back toward the counter. And I still want that cuff wrapped. Consider the broken case a lesson in better craftsmanship. I said nothing further. I simply took a photograph of the wreckage on my phone, time-stamped, and texted it directly to Desmond along with 3 words, Add it up. By the time I left the boutique that night, the running total of Nadia Prescott's evening, the cuff, the case, and the 2 hours of a terrified clerk's labor, I quietly compensated out of my own pocket, rather than penalize the young woman for a mess she never caused, had climbed past $110,000, every cent of it destined to land, eventually on a ledger with Jun-Ho's name at the top and nowhere left to hide. "He gave me this," Nadia said, holding up her wrist, where a thin gold bracelet caught the boutique lighting. A family heirloom, his mother's, meant for his real wife. She smiled at the terrified clerk like the words tasted sweet. "So wrap the cuff, and maybe I'll forget you hesitated." I recognized that bracelet. I had one just like it in my safe at home, given to me on our wedding night, and Jun had told me the exact same story his mother's keepsake meant for his one true wife. The story was recycled. The bracelet, I would later learn, was a cheap replica he'd had made in bulk because sincerity was never his strong suit, only repetition of a script that had worked before. "He didn't recognize me tonight either," Nadia went on, checking her phone, oblivious. "He said he'd surprise his wife with something bigger once the deal closes tomorrow. Once the Hartley Group signs on, he said, money won't matter anymore. He'll finally be free of her." The clerk looked at me, silently pleading, not understanding why the woman in the grey coat hadn't left yet. "I'll take the account authorization form," I said quietly, stepping forward for the first time. "I'm the majority tenant reviewer for this floor tonight. Let me see the transfer request." Nadia barely glanced at me. "This doesn't concern outside staff. Step aside." "I'm not outside staff," I said, "but you're right that this doesn't concern you. Not for much longer." She laughed, the kind of laugh people give when they've never once been told no and can't process the sound of it. "Cute! Do you know who you're talking to?" "I'm the future of Han Vantage Group. Tomorrow the Hartley Group signs a $12 million backing deal directly with President Han, and after that, nobody in this city says no to me. Certainly not some floor clerk playing dress-up in a jewelry store." I let her finish. I always let them finish. "It's the same reason I never argue with a fire before it's had a chance to show me exactly how big it's going to get." "Wrap the cuff," I told the clerk gently. "Charge it to Han Vantage Group's corporate account under a temporary hold, pending review." I looked at Nadia. "You'll have your cuff by morning. Enjoy the party." She smirked, victorious, certain she'd just bullied a stranger into submission. She had no idea she'd just handed me a paper trail with her own name on it, time-stamped the night before the biggest event of Han Vantage Group's public life. I went home. I did not confront Jun that night. I poured a glass of wine, sat at my kitchen island, and read through the file Desmond had built. 6 months of transfers, apartment rent, a car lease, $200,000 funneled through a shell vendor called Prescott Concepts LLC, which existed on paper only to receive Han Vantage Group invoices for brand consulting services that were never rendered. Every dollar traced back through Crown Atrium's own building management software, because Jun had never once imagined I would look. But here's the part that made my hands go still over the keyboard. The transfers weren't only signed off by Jun. Every single one carried a secondary authorization from Silas Cruz, Chief Operating Officer of Han Vantage Group, Jun's oldest friend, the man who'd stood beside him at our wedding as best man. Silas had approved every payment to Prescott Concepts. Silas had also, according to the internal audit trail, been quietly transferring an additional, much larger sum, nearly $4 million, into an offshore account with no name attached to Han Vantage Group at all. Jun was cheating, but somebody underneath him was stealing and using the affair as the perfect smokescreen to do it in plain sight. I didn't sleep that night. I planned instead. This wasn't just a love story dying quietly in a kitchen at midnight. It was becoming the kind of slow-burn romance gone cold that only makes sense once you see every card on the table. And I intended to see every single one before the sun came up on the unveiling. The next morning, the day of the gala, Jun called me from the office, his voice bright with the particular cheerfulness men use right before they ask you for money. "Honey, did you see the wire request I sent? I need $300,000 released from the Atrium's event contingency fund. Insurance on the new floor. The Hartley Group's lawyers are strict about liability before they'll sign tomorrow's backing agreement." "Insurance," I repeated. "That's right. Once Hartley signs, we're talking $12 million in fresh capital. You'll never have to worry about a dime again. You've never worried about a dime in your life, Jun. You've had me for that." He laughed, misreading the ice in my voice as tired affection. That's why I love you. Practical to the bone. I'll make it up to you. Once the deal closes, I'll buy you anything you want. I already have everything I need, I said. I own the building, the deal is closing in. There was a pause, brief, almost imperceptible, and then he laughed again, louder, covering it. Of course you do, baby. I'll see you tonight. I hung up and looked at Desmond, who was waiting by the door with the printed audit file in a black folder. Get me everything on Silas Cruz's offshore transfers by tonight, I said, and get the building's legal team ready to draft an emergency lease termination clause. I want it airtight by 6 o'clock. You're going to shut it down at the gala, Desmond said. It wasn't a question. I'm going to let them build the whole stage themselves first, I said. Then I'm going to turn off the lights. That evening, Crown Atrium's top floor glittered the way only old money and new ambition can make a room glitter. International financiers from the Hartley Group mingled with shipping executives, city officials, and the entire senior staff of Han Vantage Group, all gathered under crystal chandeliers. I had personally approved the design for 18 months earlier. Jun stood at the center of it in a black suit, glowing with the particular confidence of a man who believes tomorrow belongs to him. President Han, one of the Hartley representatives, said, raising a glass, building an empire like this in 3 years, that's one of a kind. Just hard work, Jun said, modest in the way men are modest when they expect to be contradicted and praised for their humility. And good instincts. We hear the Hartley Group is prepared to commit $12 million tomorrow, another guest said. With backing like that, nobody in this industry tells you no again. Absolutely, Jun said. It's an honor to have their confidence. I watched from the edge of the room in a deep burgundy suit, a leather folder tucked under my arm, a glass of champagne I had no intention of finishing. Nadia arrived 20 minutes later in the same wine-colored gown from the boutique, the sapphire cuff gleaming on her wrist, moving through the room like she'd already been crowned something. She spotted me near the bar and, not recognizing the woman from the jewelry store in this new context of gowns and lighting, decided to make a show of dismissing me all over again. You're the assistant who authorized my cuff last night, she said, loud enough for a small cluster of guests to turn. I should thank you. Though I'm surprised staff got invited to the actual event. I go where I'm needed, I said. Well, you're needed to fetch me a drink. And while you're at it, tell whoever's running this event that the centerpiece flowers on table 6 are wrong. I specifically requested white. A few guests laughed uncomfortably. Jun, drawn by the commotion, crossed the room, his smile faltering slightly when he saw who Nadia was speaking to. Nadia, he said quietly, a warning in his voice. Jun, tell your staff to be more careful who they let mingle with real guests, Nadia said breezily, oblivious to the tension radiating off him. This one's been trailing me since last night. Nadia, Jun said again, sharper. What? I'm only saying what everyone's thinking. Some people don't know their place. She turned back to me, smiling with all her teeth. So run along, sweetheart. Tell your manager Han Vantage Group expects better service. Here's where I want you to comment the word fundtin if you've ever stood quietly in a room, underestimated by someone who had no idea what you were actually standing on. Because that word is exactly what I thought of as I watched Jun's face go pale, torn between the woman he'd been sneaking money to and the woman whose signature was on the deed beneath both their feet. I'll tell my manager, I said calmly. Since I am my manager, Vivienne Calloway, Chief Executive Officer, Calloway Retail Holdings, LLC. Sole owner of the building you're currently standing in, Miss Prescott. The room went quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet when a chandelier suddenly seems to be listening too. You're Nadia's confidence cracked for the first time. You're Jun's wife? I'm his wife, I said. I'm also his landlord. His 4 floors of headquarters, his event permits, his building access badges, his contingency insurance fund, he asked me to release this morning every one of those things exists because I allow them to exist. Would you like to reconsider the flowers on table 6, or shall we discuss the $300,000 routed to your apartment through a shell vendor called Prescott Concepts? Jun's face drained of color entirely. Vivienne, this isn't let me explain. You don't have to explain to me tonight, Jun, I said. You're going to explain to the Hartley Group tomorrow when they ask why their $12 million backing partner has been quietly bleeding his own operating budget to fund a mistress under a fake consulting contract. I'm sure they'll find it fascinating. Not here, he said, gripping my elbow harder than a husband should ever grip his wife in public, steering me away from the crowd toward the private boardroom just off the main atrium floor, the one reserved for closing signatures on the Hartley deal the following morning. Silas followed close behind, shutting the door with a soft, deliberate click. "You're going to embarrass me in front of $12 million of backing," Jun said, his charm gone entirely now, replaced by something colder, more desperate. One phone call, Vivienne. That's all you'd need to fix this. Release the contingency funds, tell the room it was a misunderstanding, and none of this ever happened. It already happened, I said. You don't get to unhappen a paper trail 6 months deep. Then sign this, Silas said smoothly, sliding a single document across the boardroom table, already prepared, already notarized in advance, as though they'd planned for exactly this contingency. An emergency authorization releasing the atrium's contingency fund into Han Vantage Group's operating account, effective immediately in your capacity as majority tenant sponsor. Sign it, and the Hartley deal closes clean tomorrow. No audit, no headlines. Everyone walks away with what they need. And if I don't? Then Jun loses everything he's built in 3 years in front of every partner he's ever courted, Silas said, his voice never rising, which somehow made it worse. And you lose a husband who, whatever else he's done, still made your name mean something in rooms you never used to be invited into. I looked at the document. Every line of it had been drafted with genuine legal precision, the kind of paperwork Silas Cruz had clearly been perfecting for exactly this moment, expecting a woman cornered in a private room to sign whatever was placed in front of her simply to make the pressure stop. "Give me the pen," I said. Jun exhaled, relief flooding his face too quickly, the way relief always floods the face of a man who's never once had to work for anything he wanted. I took the pen. I read every line once more, slowly, deliberately, letting them believe I was simply steadying my nerves. Then I signed. Vivienne Calloway. Not Vivienne Calloway Han. Not the entity name on the authorization line, which read, in small formal print, Calloway Retail Holdings LLC, by authorized signatory. I signed my personal name, in my personal capacity, on a line that legally required the signature of the LLC's authorized officer acting in her corporate role. It looked identical to anyone glancing at it across a table. It was, in every way that mattered to a court of law, worthless. An authorization signed by an individual has no binding power over funds legally held by a limited liability company, and Calloway Retail Holdings LLC had never once, in its entire history, authorized any signatory but its officer acting explicitly in that title. "There," I said, sliding the document back across the table. "Done." "Thank you," Jun said, already reaching for his phone to notify the Hartley representatives the misunderstanding had been resolved. "Before you make that call," I said, "you should know that document isn't worth the paper it's printed on. You asked Vivienne Calloway to sign it. Vivienne Calloway isn't the authorized officer of Calloway Retail Holdings LLC in any capacity recognized by that agreement. You needed Vivienne Calloway, Chief Executive Officer, acting explicitly in that title, and neither of you thought to specify it, because neither of you actually read the entity structure of the building you've been operating inside of for 3 years. You built an empire on marble you never once asked who truly owned." Silas's composure cracked for the first time that night. "You signed it deliberately wrong." "I signed it exactly as it was written," I said. "You drafted a sloppy document assuming panic would do the rest of your work for you. That's not my failure to correct. That's yours." "Vivienne, please," Jun said, all pretense gone now, his voice thinning into something close to begging. "The Hartley deal signs in 12 hours. If it falls through, then it falls through," I said, standing, smoothing my jacket, walking back toward the door. "You should go tell your investors the truth before I do. I imagine it will sound better coming from you, though I doubt it will sound good either way." I walked back onto the main floor with the two of them trailing behind me, and that's when the real reckoning began in front of everyone who mattered. "You wouldn't," he said, low, urgent, grabbing my arm. "Vivienne, think about what you're threatening. Everything I've built, you built 4 floors on marble I own, using a signature system I designed, funded partly by a wife you were embezzling from," I said, pulling my arm free without raising my voice. "I'm not threatening anything, Jun. I'm simply telling you what's already true. Nadia, recovering some of her composure once the initial shock of my introduction wore off, decided to play the only card she had left. "This is absurd," she announced to the room, loud enough to carry over the string quartet still valiantly playing near the bar. "I'm carrying his child. Jun's child. Whatever paperwork this woman thinks she owns doesn't change that I am the one who's going to give this family its future, not some landlord playing dress-up as a wife." A ripple of gasps moved through the nearest cluster of guests. Jun's face, already pale, went a shade paler still. "Is that true?" I asked him directly, my voice even, almost clinical, the way I ask a contractor whether a delay is going to cost me a week or a month. "Vivienne, he started. "It's true," Nadia said before he could finish, wrapping her hand possessively around his arm. "He's known for 2 months. He just hasn't found the right time to tell his wife, because apparently there's never a convenient hour to admit you're building a real family with someone who actually makes you happy." "Then congratulations are in order," I said calmly, watching Jun's expression carefully. Though I'd recommend confirming that with an actual physician before announcing it to a room full of financiers, Miss Prescott. I happen to know Han Vantage Group's group health plan runs entirely through Crown Atrium's benefits administrator, and I checked this morning, out of nothing more than professional curiosity, whether any claims had been filed under your name in the last 6 months. There were none. Not a single prenatal visit, not a single lab request, nothing. If you're pregnant, Miss Prescott, you've managed it without ever once seeing a doctor, which I'm told is a fairly remarkable medical achievement. Nadia's grip on Jun's arm loosened. That's private information. You had no right to look. "I own the benefits administrator," I said simply. "I have every right to know what my own building's insurance dollars are funding. Try again." "Jun," Nadia said, turning to him, her voice climbing toward panic now. Tell her it's true." Jun said nothing. He simply stared at the floor, and in his silence the entire room understood exactly what kind of lie had just collapsed in real time, in front of the very people whose money depended on trusting every word that came out of his mouth. "I only ever wanted what was mine," Nadia said quietly, almost to herself, the fight finally draining out of her voice. "He told me I'd have all of it eventually. The company, the name, everything. He said his wife was just a formality he'd outgrown. He tells a very convincing story," I said. "He told me the same one, 3 years ago, about a mother's heirloom bracelet that turned out to be a mass-produced replica he'd bought off a catalogue. Consistency, if nothing else, has always been his strong suit." That's when Silas Cruz stepped forward from the crowd, smooth as ever, his hand raised in placation, playing peacemaker in front of the Hartley executives who were beginning to look distinctly uncomfortable. "Let's not do this here," Silas said. "Jun, Vivienne, whatever this is, it's a private matter. Let's not embarrass the company in front of our partners." "Silas is right," Jun said quickly, latching onto the interruption like a life raft. "Vivienne, please, we can discuss this at home." "Funny you'd want to protect the company's reputation right now, Silas," I said, turning to him. "Considering nearly $4 million of that company's money has quietly disappeared into an account with your fingerprints all over the authorization trail, and none of it went to Miss Prescott's apartment." Silas's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. "I don't know what you're referring to." "I do," I said. I had a very long night reading through 6 months of transfers. Jun was careless enough to cheat with company money. You were smart enough to let him take the fall for something 10 times bigger, hiding behind his affair as cover while you quietly moved $4 million offshore under an account with no name on it at all. "Tell me, Silas, when the Hartley Group signs tomorrow, were you planning to be sitting in Jun's chair by the time anyone noticed the money was gone?" A murmur rippled through the gathered financiers. One of the Hartley representatives pulled out his phone, already texting someone, his expression hardening. "This is absurd," Silas said, his composure finally slipping. "Jun, don't listen to her. She's trying to destroy everything you've built out of jealousy." "I'm not trying to destroy anything," I said. "I'm simply the one holding the lease. And leases, gentlemen, can be terminated." I turned to the room, to the Hartley representatives whose faces had gone from polite interest to open alarm. Han Vantage Group's headquarters, warehouse contracts, and event permits are all held under agreements with Calloway Retail Holdings. As of tonight, given clear evidence of financial misconduct occurring on these premises, I'm exercising my right as owner to suspend all active leases and access credentials pending a full audit. You can't do that in the middle of an event, Jun said, panic rising in his voice for the first time. Vivienne, the deal signs tomorrow morning. If Hartley walks, then Hartley walks, I said. That's not my problem. It was never my problem. It was always yours. You just never noticed, because you assumed the ground under your feet would always belong to somebody easy to overlook. I stepped back and nodded once toward the far side of the room, where Desmond had been standing quietly by the elevator bank the entire evening, phone in hand, waiting for exactly this moment. He nodded back and made the call. Every screen in the atrium, the digital directory boards, the event livestream monitors set up to broadcast the unveiling to a secondary press room downstairs, even the small tablet the building's front desk representative was holding at the entrance flickered and refreshed within seconds. 4 words appeared in stark black text against a white background, stamped in red beneath. ACCESS Denard. Funds Rosen. Ol Ace terminated. Revoked. The front desk representative, a young man in a black suit who had no idea what was happening, looked down at his clipboard in confusion as Han Vantage Group's badge credentials failed one after another in real time. Guests' phones buzzing with automated notifications that the 4th floor headquarters access system was now restricted. Jun's own executive badge, clipped to his jacket, blinked red when he instinctively reached for the elevator panel to escape the room. "What did you do?" he said, staring at his badge like it had betrayed him personally. "I made one call," I said. "The same kind of call I could have made any day in the last 3 years, except I never needed to, because you never gave me a reason to look too closely." Congratulations, Jun. You just became the first case study in what happens when you build an empire on somebody else's foundation and forget to check who's still holding the deed. The room had gone fully silent now, the string quartet finally stopping mid-phrase, as though even the musicians understood there was no appropriate tempo left to play. Guests who had spent the last hour laughing over champagne now stood frozen, phones half-raised, unsure whether it was safer to record the collapse unfolding in front of them or pretend they'd seen nothing at all. A few of the younger associates from Han Vantage Group's own staff quietly began edging toward the coat check, already calculating, I imagine, how quickly they could update their resumes once word of tonight reached every trade publication on the eastern seaboard. The Hartley representatives were already moving toward the exit, phones pressed to their ears, the deal that was meant to close tomorrow morning, dissolving in real time in front of 40 witnesses and a dozen phone cameras that would have this story online before the elevators even reached the lobby. Nadia, stripped of her cuffs, borrowed shine, looked between Jun and Silas with dawning horror. Wait, the apartment, the car, all of it, that money's frozen? Jun, tell me that's not. Shut up, Nadia. Jun snapped, and in that single sentence 3 years of careful charm finally cracked open to show the frightened, cornered man underneath. Everyone remain calm, Silas said, trying one last time to steady the room, though his voice had lost its polish. This is a misunderstanding that can be resolved. It can be resolved by an audit, I said, which is already underway. Silas, you should probably call whoever's expecting that $4 million and let them know the transfer's been flagged for federal review. Building security has already forwarded the trail to the appropriate authorities, given the scale of the discrepancy. Silas's jaw tightened. For the first time all night, the room understood that the real threat in the building had never been Jun's affair at all. It had been the quiet man standing at his shoulder for 3 years, smiling in every photo, signing off on every disaster, waiting for exactly the kind of public collapse he could use to step into the empty chair. How long? Jun asked quietly, ignoring the room around them entirely now. His voice hollowed out in a way I'd never once heard in 3 years of marriage. How long have you been doing this to me? Since the day the board named you president instead of me, Silas said, and there was no theatre left in his voice at all, just a tired, worn-down honesty that was somehow more unsettling than any of his earlier composure. You think I forgot that I built half of this company from nothing alongside you? You think I forgot the years I spent in warehouses at 3 in the morning while you were upstairs learning how to charm investors? The board looked at us both and picked the face they liked better. I decided a long time ago I wasn't going to spend the rest of my career fetching coffee for the man they picked instead of me. You put Nadia in my office, Jun said slowly, turning on Silas, understanding dawning too late. You approved every transfer to her. You knew I'd get caught eventually, and you needed the distraction to move your own money before anyone noticed. Don't be dramatic, Silas said, but his eyes were already scanning the room for an exit that wasn't going to open for him. I'm not being dramatic, Jun said. I trusted you since we were nothing. I trusted you more than I trusted my own wife, and you were robbing me the entire time, using my own mistress as cover. You robbed yourself the moment you put your hands on Nadia, Silas said coldly, finally dropping the mask entirely. I just made sure it counted for something. 4 million was never going to move quietly through your name, Jun. It needed a face nobody would suspect until it was too late. Congratulations. You were the perfect distraction. The Hartley Group's lead representative reappeared at the edge of the circle, having clearly made several calls in the last 2 minutes. Mrs. Calloway, he said, addressing me directly for the first time. The Hartley Group would like to formally withdraw from tomorrow's signing, and separately extend our sincerest interest in speaking with you directly about future partnership opportunities involving Crown Atrium. I appreciate that, I said. Though I should be clear, I have no interest in inheriting the wreckage of Han Vantage Group. Whatever's left of it after tonight is between the three of them and whichever authorities Silas Cruz's $4 million eventually finds their way to. Jun said nothing to that. There was nothing left to say to a man who had just admitted, in front of 40 witnesses, that his entire loyalty had been a slow-burning grudge waiting 3 years for the right night to collect on itself. 2 of my own building's compliance officers moved in at that point, flanked by 2 uniformed officers who had been quietly called in earlier that evening, standing near the service elevator the entire time, waiting on my signal. Silas didn't resist. He'd built his entire strategy on nobody looking closely enough, and once the room turned its full attention on him, there was nowhere left for that kind of man to hide. Jun grabbed my arm again as they led Silas away, his voice dropping to something almost pleading. Vivienne, please. Whatever's happening with Silas, that's separate from us. I made a mistake with Nadia. One mistake. Let me fix this. I'll end it with her tonight. I'll do anything. You already did everything, Jun, I said. You just did it to the wrong woman's building. I want to say something honest here, because this genre likes to pretend heartbreak always ends in tears. But the truth is, I felt lighter standing in that atrium than I had in 3 years. This wasn't dark romance dressed up as tragedy. It was the exact moment a woman who'd spent 3 years being underestimated finally let the room see the whole ledger, and there is nothing quite like watching a man realize, in real time, that the empire he thought he'd built was never really his to lose. The next morning, the story was everywhere before I'd finished my coffee. Han Vantage Group's stock, privately held but publicly traded through a minority offering, collapsed by 40% within hours. The Hartley Group issued a formal statement withdrawing all backing discussions pending resolution of internal financial irregularities. Silas Cruz was formally charged within the week, the $4 million traced through 6 shell accounts straight back to a private buyer connected to a rival logistics conglomerate that had been circling Han Vantage Group's warehouse contracts for over a year, waiting for exactly this kind of collapse to make an acquisition play. Nadia Prescott disappeared from the city entirely within 72 hours. Her name quietly scrubbed from every professional record she'd built under Han Vantage Group's letterhead. The shell company Prescott Concepts dissolved by the state within a month once the fraud investigation named it directly. The story broke online within hours, exactly as I expected it would. Somebody's phone footage from the gala floor made its way onto every business news account by morning. The 4 words on those screens: access denied, funds frozen, all accounts terminated, revoked, captioned and recaptioned 1,000 different ways by people who had never set foot in Crown Atrium but understood instantly what kind of ending they were watching. I didn't give a single interview. I didn't need to. The paperwork spoke clearly enough on its own, and I've always found that the quietest kind of vindication carries the furthest. The federal filing against Silas Cruz named the buyer behind those 6 shell accounts within 3 weeks a rival logistics conglomerate called Draven Maritime, which had spent the better part of a year quietly courting Silas with promises of a corner office and a controlling stake in whatever remained of Han Vantage Group once its president was disgraced enough to be pushed out. It was, investigators later confirmed, never really about Jun's affair at all. Nadia Prescott had simply been the softest, most convenient lever Silas could find to pull. A distraction dressed up as romance, engineered so precisely that even Jun never suspected his own best friend had cast his mistress like an actor reading lines. I sat through 2 days of preliminary hearings, not because I had to, but because I wanted to watch, in person, the exact moment a man who had spent 3 years managing my husband's every calendar realized that loyalty had only ever been a costume he wore for convenience. "I built half of what he has," Silas said on the stand, when the prosecutor asked why he'd done it. "I deserved more than a corner office and a handshake every quarter. I deserved to be the one signing the checks, not the one fetching coffee for a man who got lucky marrying into somebody else's empire." "You didn't deserve $4 million of laundered freight contracts," the prosecutor said. "You stole it." "I redistributed it," Silas said, and something in the flatness of his own voice seemed to surprise even him, as though hearing the justification out loud for the first time made it sound as hollow as it truly was. He was sentenced to 11 years on federal wire fraud and racketeering charges. Draven Maritime's acquisition bid collapsed entirely once its ties to the scheme became public, and the company's own board forced out 3 senior executives within the month, unwilling to let one ambitious lieutenant's greed cost them a decade of carefully built reputation. Nadia Prescott was never formally charged. There was no clean paper trail proving she'd known the full scope of what Silas orchestrated around her, but her name became radioactive in every industry circle from the coast inward. I heard, second-hand, that she surfaced 8 months later in a different city under a slightly altered spelling of her own name, attaching herself to another executive with a wandering eye and an underprotected signature. Some patterns, I've learned, don't break. They just relocate. Jun called me 11 times over the following 2 weeks. I answered once. "I've lost everything," he said, and for the first time in 3 years, I believed every word out of his mouth, because for the first time in 3 years, he had nothing left to gain by lying to me. The board removed me. The remaining investors want nothing to do with the Han name. "Vivienne, I know I don't deserve it, but is there any way at all you'd consider vouching for me? Just enough to rebuild something. Anything." "You're asking me to lend you my name again," I said. "The same name you used to fund an affair and disguise it as insurance." "I know I don't deserve it," he said again, quieter this time. "You're right," I said. "You don't. And I want you to understand something, Jun, so you carry it with you into whatever comes next. I never destroyed your empire out of jealousy, and I never destroyed it out of revenge dressed up as heartbreak. I destroyed it because the moment you decided my building, my name, and my patience were resources to be spent without asking, you stopped being my husband and started being a liability sitting on property I owned. That's not an emotional decision. That's a business one. I don't make those twice." I hung up, and I never took another one of his calls again. He asked to see me in person once, 4 months after the gala, through a lawyer's letter formal enough that I almost didn't recognize his voice in it anymore. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity, and mostly because I wanted to see with my own eyes what was left of a man once every door he'd walked through for 3 years had quietly locked behind him. He looked smaller than I remembered, sitting across from me in a rented conference room that smelled faintly of old carpet and cheaper coffee than the kind Han Vantage Group used to serve at its own headquarters. No tailored suit, no confidence humming just under the surface of every sentence. "I'm not asking for money," he said, before I'd even sat down fully. "I know better than to ask you for that." "Good," I said, "because you wouldn't get it." "I found a position," he said. "Warehouse operations, 3 states over. Mid-level. Nothing close to what I had, but it's honest work, and I'd like to keep it. The company's compliance office wants a reference confirming I wasn't personally named in the fraud charges. Legally, I wasn't. You know that. Silas structured it so my signature never touched the offshore transfers directly. I only need someone with standing to confirm that in writing. 1 letter, Vivienne. That's all I'm asking. "You're asking me to lend you my name one more time," I said. "The same name you used to disguise an affair as insurance." "I know I don't deserve it," he said quietly, and for the first time in 3 years, I believed every word out of his mouth, because for the first time in 3 years, he had nothing left to gain by lying to me. "You're right," I said. "You don't. And I want you to carry something with you into whatever comes next, Jun, because I don't think you've understood it yet, even now. I never destroyed what you built out of jealousy, and I never destroyed it out of some private need for revenge dressed up as heartbreak. I destroyed it because the moment you decided my building, my name, and my patience were resources to be spent without asking. You stopped being my husband and started being a liability sitting on property I owned. That was never an emotional decision. It was a business one. I only had to make it once. So that's it," he said. "No letter, no reference, nothing. You'll have to build your reference the way I built mine," I said, standing, gathering my folder from the table. "One honest year at a time, with your own name on the paperwork, answering to somebody whose trust you'll actually have to earn back from nothing. I did it once already. I know exactly how long it takes." I left him sitting there, in a rented conference room, 3 states from anywhere that used to matter to him, and I never took another one of his calls again. 6 months later, Crown Atrium's top floor reopened under a new name, the Calloway Concourse, with the Hartley Group as an anchor investment partner after all, this time with my name on every document instead of hiding quietly beneath somebody else's signature. Desmond still runs security. The chandeliers are the same ones I approved 18 months before any of this happened, glittering over a room that finally, fully, belongs to the woman who built it. If there's one thing I want anyone watching this to understand, it's that underdog stories rarely look the way people expect. Nobody handed me a miracle. Nobody swept in to save me. I simply kept my own ledger clean, kept my own name separate from a marriage I should have questioned far sooner, and waited until the exact moment the truth could do the most damage before I ever said a word out loud. Some people call that patience. I call it owning the deed to your own life, long before anyone else realizes you were holding it the entire time. I heard, a few months after the story broke, that Jun took a job managing warehouse logistics for a company 3 states away, working under a name that wasn't his own anymore, because nobody in this industry would touch the Han name without flinching. I heard Silas is still awaiting sentencing. I heard Nadia resurfaced briefly in a different city, running the exact same kind of scheme on a different unsuspecting executive, and I hope, sincerely, that whoever's building she walks into next owns the floor she's standing on, too. As for me, I stood at the edge of the Calloway Concourse on its reopening night, in a burgundy suit, a leather folder tucked under my arm, watching a new set of financiers raise their glasses to an empire that had always, quietly, entirely belonged to me. Desmond stood near the elevator bank the same way he always had, nodding once when our eyes met, the two of us sharing the particular quiet satisfaction of people who'd spent 3 years watching a slow-burn romance curdle into something worth ending cleanly rather than dragging out for the sake of appearances. I've thought often, in the months since, about the version of that night where I never checked my phone, never read a text that wasn't meant for me, never let Desmond pull 6 months of transfer records before the sun came up. I could have lived comfortably inside that ignorance for years, the way plenty of women I know have chosen to, telling themselves that a certain kind of dark romance is simply the price of a certain kind of lifestyle. I don't judge them for it. I understand the exhaustion that makes silence look like peace. But I built an empire out of paying close attention to details other people assumed I was too busy, too trusting, or too in love to notice. And I wasn't about to abandon that discipline the one time it actually mattered most. Some love stories end in heartbreak. Mine simply ended in an audit, a phone call, and the unmistakable sound of every door in that building locking at exactly the same time. If you've ever built something with your own hands only to watch someone else try to quietly stand on top of it and call it theirs, I hope you remember, the way I finally did, that the deed was always in your name the whole time. You just have to be willing to make the one call that proves it.